Hello and welcome to episode 3 of In Sync. In episode 2, I shared you through 30 years of my life and I talked about inner architecture, and we could see some real patterns emerging in the various stories and experiences that I shared with you. There was the university counsellor guiding me to a university degree I hadn't thought about. There was the experience meeting that gentleman in the hallway that led me to a graduate position at a wonderful firm that I didn't even know about. There was the 2 a.m. wake-up calls that led to discovering a book by Tony Robbins. And then there was the billboard leading me to the event. And then eventually I shared how there was an experience in Orlando, Florida that allowed me to go to the next level as well. None of it was planned, but it was all deeply connected. So in this episode, I'd like to give that pattern a name, and I'd like to do that by sharing a few stories with you. And then I'll go into the framework so that you can take something away from this episode. So back when I was having my campus interviews when I was in university, I felt like I was going through the motions. I met that stranger in the hallway, well-dressed guy, young guy, and we clicked and vibed. And he led me to then asking for another copy of my resume that I borrowed from one of the other interviews. I had the interview, I got a letter for a second interview, ended up getting a job at the organization as a graduate, and then went on to starting my career there. So when we look at those things that had occurred, was that something that you would describe as random, or was there something else appearing? Was there something else showing up? And perhaps there was something else. And that something else certainly showed up again for me at many different times in my life. But back in 2008, I was newly married to my now ex-partner, and I decided that I was going to invite her to go on a trip with me to the UK and Europe and show her a little bit about, the country that I spent 8 years of my life living in when I lived in the UK. So we landed at London Airport and we were driving from London Gatwick to Wales, and it was about a 4 or 5 hour drive. So we had some time to kill on the journey. And we had this conversation about free will versus destiny, and we kind of initiated the conversation a couple of weeks earlier before we arrived in the UK, but we decided we were going to use this time to really get into the meat of the argument. And we were both making really well-formed arguments for either side, and when it came down to it, we just couldn't agree on which one it was. And it was at that point that I got a little bit frustrated, and I just reached a point where I just felt like I wanted to know, which one is it? Do we come into this world with our lives scripted and predestined, or do we have free will to completely control and decide whatever we want in our life? And I just recall at that moment, just on that drive, just calling out to something greater and saying, look, I want an answer to the question. And I want it to come from someone credible, not some woo-woo fluffy person, because there are, a little bit of that going around, but someone grounded, someone that I could rely on. And that was it. I put that question out there and I let it go. And we continued on our trip and didn't really think about it again. And then all of a sudden, we're about a week later, and we returned to the airport to make our way home back to the US where we were living at the time. And we went past security at the airport, and my now ex, she liked buying magazines, so we would always go into a news agent before jumping on a plane. And I just remember being in that news agency and about to head home, and I just noticed in the corner of the news agency there was a book, but this time it was different to what I experienced back then at the My department store when I discovered the Tony Robbins book. All I could see was the spine. I couldn't see the front. It just stood out to me. So I walked over to the book and I picked it up, and the title of the book was Synchronicity by Deepak Chopra. Now, I wasn't looking for a book on synchronicity. I didn't really know anything about it at that stage. I was looking for an answer to destiny versus free will. So, when this book came up, in that moment, I just knew I had to buy the book. I knew that it most likely contained the answer to the question I was looking for. So I bought the book, and it was by Deepak Chopra. He was someone who I'd learned a bit about for a little while before that, and I knew that he had done a lot of fantastic work bringing science and spirituality together, but he brought it together in a way that was very grounded in real science. So I knew I could trust what he said. So I immediately knew, because of how I felt, that I had to buy the book. So I bought it, started reading on the plane, and it certainly had the answer to what I was looking for. And I won't give away the plot because it's a wonderful book. And that gave me a lot more than the question I was looking for an answer to, because this book gave me a deeper understanding of synchronicity. It certainly taught me things about it that I never knew of before, and it was well grounded. And because of that experience, and in addition, because of the other events, the other synchronistic events that led to my ex-partner and I meeting each other, we decided to call our DJ group Synchronicity. She was a DJ, and I was interested in the music that she was DJing. So we decided that we were going to form our own little DJ duo group, and we called it Synchronicity, and we had some fun with that. And then fast forward about 6 years later, it's 2014. We're living in Southern California in a small beach city, less than 500,000 people. And we started to think about opening up our own coaching practice. So we decided to go ahead with it, and I was going to use some of the skills I'd learned through Tony Robbins, some of that transformational coaching. And she was developing an interest in positive psychology and decided that she was going to do that as well. So we decided we were going to look for an office to sublease on a part-time basis. And we ended up finding a place that was a small professional building, just with lots of health practitioners, counselors, psychologists, that type of place, 15 to 20 small offices. And it also had a shared waiting room. And the person that was subleasing her office, she had a lovely office. It was really professionally looking, and we thought it was an ideal fit. But when we were also checking out the shared waiting room, and this was after we liked the feel of it because it had that shared waiting room. And so we decided to go ahead and we subleased it for a period while we worked on developing our practice. And then one day we were in the shared waiting room, having walked in, and it has typical kind of things that you'd see in a waiting room, some books and some magazines, that kind of thing. And there was a small coffee table right there where you could sit down and wait. And it had a cassette tape, the old cassette tapes from like the 70s, 80s and 90s. And it had that cassette tape in it, and it was a cassette tape set by Deepak Chopra called Synchro-Destiny. And this was more of a workbook though. So it was the same material, the same content, 6 years later, different container, but more of a practical workbook. So of course, we freaked out. We thought, there's no coincidence in this, right? This is something more meaningful going on. So, but we didn't have a cassette player because it was 2014. Who listened to cassette tapes in 2014? Even CDs were making their way out at that point, and we had MP3s. But I needed a way of listening to them. But I managed to find on Amazon, there was this device that you could get which transferred cassettes to MP3s. So I went and bought it, and then went and borrowed the Synchro-Destiny cassette tapes, and I converted it to digital format so that I could return the tapes back to the waiting room. And sure enough, it had some amazing content that allowed me to deepen my understanding of synchronicity and therefore begin applying it a little bit more deeply in my life. And then the last story I just wanted to share was a little bit about the Orlando conference. Remember, so we're in Orlando, it's 2015, the Positive Psychology conference that we were excited to go to, but when we got there, it was really dry and academic, and we decided we were going to leave and go have some more fun with some cocktails, right? And on our way out, we heard some applause, we poked our heads in, and I discovered David Cooper and Appreciative Inquiry, and we got 2 seats in the front row, so obviously I was meant to be there. And that led me to discovering a master's degree, which allowed me to go to another level in my academic education And it also taught me a number of things that I've been able to use in one of the other core components of the InSync OS that we'll discover in the next episode. And what was obviously happening there was my inner world was beginning to get activated to the next phase of my life, and my outer world responded. So there is a clear pattern that I believe that was emerging across those various different stories that I wanted to share. Being in the hallway at the university that day with that stranger showing up at the exact moment when I was just going through the motions of interviewing for jobs that just felt wrong. Then there was the experience in London at the airport when I asked the question, and then, a week later, the answer appears in the form of a book called Synchronicity. I then 6 years later discover a cassette tape called Synchronicity that was the same material 6 years later at a different threshold in my life when I'm going through another level of change and opening up my own coaching practice. And then there's experience in Orlando a year later where we were discovering positive psychology and to do more work on our coaching businesses. We left, felt the pull back through applause that I heard through the door, popped my head in, and that put me on another journey altogether. None of it was planned, but it was all connected, all building towards something deeper, something important. So what was it that was actually happening? Well, if we can look at it from a perspective of coincidence, you could say, yes, these were just coincidental events. But if we can understand that there may be something deeper going on, then we can see that there is something else going on that is not sheer coincidence. Now, back in the time when Carl Jung was doing a lot of his work and a lot of his clinical observations, he introduced the term synchronicity, and it helped to communicate and deepen and give a name and label to other people that were experiencing this through his clinical observations. And synchronicities were not magic and not superstition or not wishful thinking, as he came to understand through decades of clinical observations with real people. But synchronicities are meaningful coincidences. These are events that are connected by meaning and not cause and effect, which is our common experience through our lives. So the way we can distinguish the difference between just a regular coincidence and a synchronistic experience is that with unconnected coincidences, we might experience something and we might just think, oh, how funny, there's a coincidence. Don't think too much of it, and we move on. With synchronicities, though, it's something we experience where we notice it and it tends to stand out, and we would think something along the lines of, wow, hold on a second. Now, that's a little too uncanny to just be a meaningless coincidence, right? And we usually feel something deeper that means something. And even if we don't have any conscious awareness or any conscious language to describe it, we know that something else had happened, but we're not trained to understand and put a language to it. So we usually just ignore them and move on, even though we can feel that type of coincidence very differently to a meaningless one. Now, Jung didn't just observe synchronicities in his many years of clinical practice. He didn't just observe synchronicities happening. He identified 6 defining principles for it that I've just renamed here just to make it a little easier to explain and understand. So if you recall the experiences that I've had, we can understand the first principle pretty easily, which is that the experiences are beyond causality. So most of us understand the principles of cause and effect, right? Which are based around time. We do something and then sometime later something else will occur as a result of what we did. That's cause and effect, and it's based around our construct of time. And synchronicities, though, are beyond time. They occur and they're connected through meaning. So That's something that Jung observed, and he was doing some work with a quantum physicist called Wolfgang Pauli. And what they found was there were some very real similarities between what Pauli was working on with quantum entanglement, where events seem to be occurring outside of regular cause and effect. So this idea of things occurring beyond causality is the first defining principle of synchronicity. And then we get to personal resonance. Personal resonance is that second defining principle. This is where we tend to feel something before our conscious mind understands it. If we can feel a sense of personal resonance when we're experiencing a synchronistic event, that can also help us understand a true synchronicity. And then the third principle is that we experience this inner-outer reflection, meaning that there's something going on inside of us, whether we're conscious of it or not, that is being reflected in our outer world. So in my case, for example, back at the university, in that hallway, what was going on inside me is I was transitioning into a new phase of my life, moving away from student to graduate professional. And the outer world reflected that by opening a doorway to the opportunity that was for my real path, rather than going down and potentially accepting jobs that I was just going through the motions on just because I thought I had to. So it's this inner-outer reflection of something on the outside reflecting what's going on the inside, whether you're aware of what the inside is showing you or not. And then the fourth principle is archetypal activation. So this is where there are deeper layers stirring, deeper layers activating and reconstructing themselves towards new identities forming, or perhaps the old identities dissolving or integrating into your new identity. And this is where we experience things like what I was experiencing with the 2 a.m. wake-ups, through my first few years at my graduate position, that led to me switching on the TV and discovering Tony Robbins. Something deeper and more internal at a deeper layer is stirring, wanting me to pay attention to what's happening at that level. And then principle number 5 is the convergence point. So this is where what's happening in our inner world meets what's happening in the outer world in that moment. So we can actually feel that through that personal resonance. And that is what is called a convergence point, right? This is where the two are converging. And it feels like we're experiencing that inner scene. Just for that moment, what we're experiencing is the inner aligning with the outer in that moment. And that brings us then to the final principle, which is transformation clustering. So this is where we notice different experiences of synchronicity around a certain time in our lives. So for example, when I was newly married and I took my now ex-partner to the UK with me, there are a number of different synchronistic events occurring around that time. Too many for me to share in this episode, but there were a number of different synchronistic events clustering around that period of transformation in my life. Being newly married and then stepping into a new chapter of my life altogether, they tend to cluster around these events, and it can occur in various different contexts of our lives. So when we also can then just look at those two events that occurred for me in 2008, when I came across the book at the airport, and then the 2014 discovery of the tape set in that shared space in the waiting room of those offices. There were two things that were different that were happening there, but they were 6 years apart, different country, different format, but it was the same content that was inviting me to go into a deeper understanding of it by giving me a workbook and not just a book for it. Now, Jung named this as symbol recurring, the same symbol recurring, the psyche confirming direction or inviting a deeper direction, wanting to be listened to, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard. And you may have had a similar recurring theme occurring in your life that perhaps you've not honored, or perhaps you've not listened to, or perhaps you have, and perhaps this is resonating deeply with you. But I know for me that what had happened when I discovered the book in 2008 was that it was great, it answered my question, and I didn't really pay too much attention to it after that. The book kind of stayed on the shelf, gathered dust for a while, and we experienced some more synchronicities throughout our life that confirmed our direction, things like that. But then the book in 2014 just gave us more confidence. And I delved into that, but I never really gave it my full attention and my full level of honoring that until now, when I've now experienced more synchronicities and over a longer period of time now, and have therefore decided to create the InSync OS because I just can't ignore it anymore. The bottom-up identity is really wanting to be seen and heard. It's speaking more loudly, and that's how I've known now throughout these 30 years of experiences that there is something more to this that I know, and have been able to learn enough about them to create a real language for us to understand, so that more of us can trust these signs and these signals and these patterns as they're occurring. So, how do you actually work with synchronicity? How do you know what to do when these meaningful coincidences show up in your lives? Well, I've been able to create a simple framework through what I've experienced in my life, and I'd like to share those with you through 3 simple steps, 3 easy ways to remember. Attune, align, act. That's all there is to it. So firstly, attune. And the way we need to do this is by setting an intention to start noticing these experiences as they occur, and then using our attention to start noticing them when they happen. So our intention and attention is how we learn to attune to noticing what's attuning or repeating in our life or carries unusual charge. And then step 2, align. Check the signal against our inner world. Does it resonate? Are we noticing that experience of personal resonance? Are we perhaps feeling a deeper level beginning to activate? And then 3, act. Taking a simple, timely response, or maybe a little bit more, but stepping into that by making a conscious decision to take some action on it. And that's it. Now, synchronicity, it isn't something that I'm suggesting that you use to replace your judgment. I'm suggesting that you use it to inform your judgment and to inform decisions that you can make by paying attention to something deeper that's going on and providing this clear framework to support it. Now, each of those steps maps to a layer of inner architecture that we discussed in the previous episode. So I'd like to just take a moment to share with you exactly how this aligns, because I think it aligns quite beautifully. So step 1, where we attune, what we're attuning to is layer 3 of our inner architecture, which is our archetypal layer, that deeper layer. That's what we're attuning to. And that's where our synchronicities originate. And then step 2, when we align, we're aligning to layer 2 of our inner architecture, which is our emotional and somatic layer, our felt resonance. We're aligning to that. And then step 3, where we act, we're aligning to layer 1, the psychological layer, where we can make a real rational decision based on what's happened, and we can acknowledge what we've experienced, and we can then make a decision around how am I going to act on that. So we can see it nicely. The attune, align, act framework for synchronicity aligns beautifully with our bottom-up development arc that we can follow throughout our lives. So when we can do this, this allows us to follow those steps to allow our deeper nature to lead, our true identity, our bottom-up identity to take the lead. And remember, as I mentioned in the previous episode, it's not that we want to make the top-down wrong, we just want to allow the bottom-up to lead. And this is how you can do that. So what is it now? What is the question, the old question that we're used to asking? when we're making decisions to move our life forward, it's usually a question that involves something like, what should I control to happen next? Or what should I force to happen next? What should I do to take control of my growth through life? But instead, we can ask a new question. Instead of asking that old question, we can ask, what is life showing me right now? What can I tune into right now using synchronicity-based navigation to tune into my inner architecture so I can move forward? This is not passive. This is where our actions can become more precisely aligned to our inner architecture and our bottom-up identity. So for me, in London, for example, I was working on achieving more, and after a while I felt like I had to keep pushing and forcing harder, and I ended up feeling worse and eventually reaching the point where something else needed to be seen, needed to be heard, but I didn't have a language for it. Now, reflecting upon that, I know that I could have been asking around what was life showing me right now, and at that time, I allowed it myself to listen to some deeper messages that were calling. So the synchronicities kept appearing. I just wasn't asking the right questions. I did eventually, but it could have happened a little sooner perhaps. So synchronicity-based navigation, it really invites us to listen to life, and it's been speaking all along. So with that, I'd like to just invite you to remember what we discussed in episode 2 with inner architecture, which was all about the structure, all about our inner structure. In this episode, we've talked about synchronicity-based navigation, how to read and trust the signals and step into and act upon them to really follow that bottom-up identity, your true nature. Both of them involve listening, receiving, and cooperating with our true selves and those deeper forces that are going on in our universe that we haven't been taught how to listen to. So with that, I'd like to invite you to consider and reflect upon, perhaps, where and when have synchronicities been showing up for you in your life? How often have they occurred? When have they occurred? And around what events and changes have they perhaps shown up in your life? In the next episode, we'll talk about what emerges when both components work together. That's aligned expression. And we'll be talking about that in episode 4. I look forward to sharing that with you. And in the meantime, if this episode has resonated with you, if you've enjoyed it, if you'd like to share it with someone else, please feel free to do so. And I'll see you in the next episode.